Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Welcome along, Michael Croker with you. Joe Wisbey is the man behind the outstanding podcast Beatles Books. I've been a long-time fan of the Beatles Book Pod, so having Joe appear here on the other side of a conversation was really exciting for me. I began by asking Joe where the inspiration for the Beatles Books podcast began.
It came from the Instagram page that I started during our old friend of the lockdown in 2020, and I was sat around here in the UK, not doing a great deal, just trying to kind of stay above water. And I noticed on Instagram there were lots of these Instagram pages that had like collections of key rings or collections of magazines or collections of cookbooks. And I thought, well, I've got this library which is behind me as we're recording of hundreds of Beatles books. Maybe I could get something from sharing those. So I just put up a picture of a Beatles book every day and got a few followers from that. And then from that, a publisher that published Ken McNabb's book, And in the End, excellent book about 1969, which I'm sure you know. And they got in touch with me and said, oh, would you like a promotional copy of this book and then advertise it on your Instagram page? And I said, yeah, free books. I'm there. Great. And from that, I had an idea. I thought, well, I'd love to know more about this book. I'd like to know more about Ken and about how he wrote this book. So I thought, well, and I had that little email address from this publisher, from Ken's publisher. So I thought, well, maybe I could speak to him and do some kind of podcast. So I reached out to Ken via this publisher, and they said, yeah, he'd be down for that. And I thought, I had no experience, I had no history in anything like that. So I thought, yeah, I'll reach out and speak to him. And from there, and Ken was brilliant and gave me loads of time and was really patient and et cetera, et cetera. And as I said, he did it on a wing and a prayer. I had no background in it. He was my second episode that I released, but he was my first interview. And it really just came from me wanting to find out more about why people write these things. As we were saying earlier, there's thousands of these things. And it's something drives an individual. I mean, any creative project is interesting, but with a book, I think, if it's done properly, you really have to burrow down into something. And any excuse to do that with the Beatles, as I said, I'm there. So, yeah, it was just something, it was just to find out more about why these authors across the globe still continue to write these books.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I used to love mining through bookstores and news agencies as a young guy, trying to find new stuff in a pre-digital age. And it was always exciting when you saw something on a stand that you hadn't seen before, and there was the cover art was completely new. And it kind of went from there for me. Where was that fire lit in you from a collector's perspective? What was the first book that kind of burst into your awareness?
Well, so I got into the Beatles when I was 8 in 1992. Because I saw Help. Help was shown on UK TV on a Sunday afternoon, and the scene where they walk into the house got me. And then my dad was and still is a fairly big Beatles fan. My dad was born in 1948, so was just the right age to experience the whole thing. Lucky old him. So he had a copy of the Hunter Davies book. And when I started to talk to him about the Beatles, when I got, even at that young age, 8 or 9, he reached from his shelf and presented me with this book. And I think he realised that some of it might not be suitable for an 8 or 9-year-old because there's a fair bit of some adventuring that the Beatles go under, even though it's fairly sanitised. It's still not suitable for someone that young. But there was enough in it that he could actually sit with me and read a bit to me and talk to me. So bedtime stories, they weren't fairy tales in my house. It was about John and Paul writing with a little help from my friends. So that was really the first book that hooked me in. And then as I got a bit older, then I got a book from the local bookshop. It's not that well known a book. I think it's just called Beatles Quote Unquote. and it's just a collection of quite literally quotes that they've given with a very basic telling of the story from the start until the kind of mid 90s. And it was almost the pictorial content that got me, because it had, I'd have been about 10 by this point. And of course, it had all the different looks. It had the mop top looks, the hippie look, the on the roof, all this. And I couldn't fathom or understand how it's the same people through the
Yeah.
book.
It's funny, the first book that blew into my awareness was Nicholas Schaffner and The
Yeah.
Beatles Forever, which I know was the case for many people. Like The Illustrated Record was another one that I think it was Roy Carr, and the other name
Yeah,
escapes
Tony
me.
Tyler.
Yes,
Tony
which was
Tyler, yeah.
another iconic, outing. That pre-digital age again was a very exciting time. I remember discovering from the UK the publisher Omnibus Press. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the first book I got at about the age of 9 was Beatles in Their Own Words, quickly followed by John Lennon in his own words. And they just seemed so beautifully produced as books. And actually, it was the first time I became aware of a publisher, because their books just stood out. So I became aware of their own brand. And of course, they've gone on to become iconic rock and music publishers. Was there a publisher for you as you got deeper into the world of Beatles books that just stood out? They seemed to understand how to represent that story.
Yeah, it has to be. Are you familiar with Genesis publications?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, as a younger person, it was out of my price range. It's not that far in my price range now, but they produced the original George Harrison's Army Mine, the still unpublished, republished Derek Taylor, 50 Years Adrift. They produced, I mean, just real works of art as books. And yeah, they, Olivia still does stuff with Genesis, the poetry book that she did 2 or 3 years ago now, that comes out through them. I think that they're artifacts sometimes, books, as much as anything else, and they're something you can, physically hold on to, obviously, but when they're done properly, like Genesis do, and yeah, the price points are fairly big. That's not always, but oftentimes. But they understand how to make it a special kind of item as much as anything else. And I mean, obviously those George Harrison and Derek Taylor books go for big money now. But if you look at them, George hand signed all of those original I Me Mines. I mean, that's I don't think I've ever even held one, let alone owned it. The Derek Taylor book, obviously, that's not even hard to find online. You can't even find excerpts of that online, and there's so much great stuff in there. But I think they didn't want to republish that because they'd had some stick for republishing the George book as a cheaper version. So they decided to keep Derek Taylor as literally a one-off. But yeah, Genesis have done just some really beautiful books. They did Ravi Shankar's book in the late 90s. I think it was called Ragamala. I can't remember. Like a biography that Oliver Krask worked on, who wrote the biography of Ravi Shankar, who I did interview. And on the back of the interview, I found that book. And again, even something like that, like a book about Ravi that's kind of a few sections out from the Beatles, it's just so, you hold it and you feel part of it. And I think Genesis are the best at doing that.
So well said. You touched on this earlier when you were fascinated by the storytelling around the Beatles and their journey. What do you think it is about that band that continues to captivate authors so much?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a combination of how and kind of why it happened. So, and it's the fact that there's layers on layers on layers. So I've had someone like Paul Howard that wrote the book about Tara Brown. Now, Tara Brown is not that's not primarily a Beatles book, but here's this guy that is friends with Paul and friends with Mike and ends up inspiring one of the best ever Beatles songs in A Day in the Life. And he lives this amazing, incredible life where obviously, he dies tragically young. He comes from this amazing Irish Guinness family. And then you look at someone like what's the guy's name? Dougie Millings, who is the tailor who jumps off a train before it goes into a concentration camp. There's just the story of the four of them is fascinating, but the people that they attracted, the people that end up in their sphere, end up being almost as fascinating as them. It's almost like, and I love the fact that you can get lost in like a moment with them. So you can spend a day with John in New York in 1980, in the summer of 1980, and the book's about double fantasy, yeah, and you can read a book and you're walking down that hot New York street with, Sean in the buggy and heading down to the Hit Factory, and there's that world, and then suddenly you can read a book about the early touring days, where suddenly you're in cold Scotland at the start of 1963 with these four guys that have got this amazing closeness, but they don't know what's going to happen. And then the next page, you're on to another story of George's 1974 US tour, where everything's going wrong, and there's all this excess, and there's long hair and moustaches and songs that no one really wants to hear anymore. And it's a whole different world from New York in 1980 or Scotland in 1963 or a summer garden in 1967 at Brian's place where John and Paul are relaxing, reading the papers and strumming the guitars. I love the fact that, I think that's the two things, is that the people that surround them are amazingly fascinating, and the fact that there's just so many different stories in this one story. I don't know if you get that with the Kinks. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. There's great stories in a lot of great rock and roll artists, as we know from publishers like Omnibus that produce these great books. But kind of, like I was reading, I was reading a book about Steve Marriott from the Small Faces and Humble Pie. And it's great, it's interesting, but it's kind of one story. It's him, and he does this, and then he does that, and then he does that, which is a bad idea, and that's a good idea. And then, but you don't get the sense that there's much else happening. When you pick up most Beatles books, the Lewison books are the best at this, because the first part of Tune In, the footnotes are as interesting as most biographies of other bands, because there's this one guy that they met that ended up, I don't know, inventing the crossword in the Times, or do you know what I mean? There's just so much stuff going on, and I think that's what it is. It never ends, and that's why we love it. I think that's why. For me, that's why I keep going back to a new angle on this story.
You've managed to describe that so beautifully that I get the feeling there's probably a book in you.
Who knows? One day maybe, when I get time.
So well described. You've had some terrific conversations. I particularly loved recently hearing Elliot Mintz, who's finally come forward and has his own work. I thought that was a terrific conversation. You've had so many. And you've got this wonderful knack of allowing space for people to share their story and get it all out, which I think is an art just unto itself. I'm sure there's many. Are there one or two conversations that maybe aren't necessarily a favourite, but they just stick out because they had a real impact on you?
Yeah. Elliot Mintz would be one, actually. That was a fascinating conversation, and that was recorded. I mean, we're doing a time difference conversation today, but because he's an insomniac, Elliot, all the interviews I think that he did for that book they were recorded like in the middle of the night in LA. So that was like 8:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning in my time. So I was like sat at home on like not a normal time to be doing an interview for me. And yeah, it felt with him, it just felt someone that was so close to the action. So I was just gripped by what he was telling me about his experiences of John and Yoko. Obviously, the Mark Lewison conversations are a highlight. I was blessed to have Mark on twice, as I'm sure you know. That was just, we kept talking and talking and talking after the tape stopped running. He was a real joy. He's absolutely the right person to be writing those books, in my humble view.
Yes.
I loved the very first conversation. I loved all the early interviews. I did Ken Womack. Ken's always great value. But I spoke to Andy Miller about the Hunter Davies biography. And Andy Miller was part of the Backlisted podcast, which is a British podcast that looks at old books, basically. And they'd done an episode on books about the Beatles in the summer of 2019, which tied in with my original inspiration, where there's a little bit of something here. And I had him on to talk about Hunter Davies, and because Andy's an author and worked in publishing, worked in different book retail in the UK, and he gave this fantastic insight about the books, about how we want different parts of the story, the Beatles story, at different points over the years. So we want Philip Norman in the early 80s when we want some kind of dirt and grime about the Beatles. We want Revolution in the Head in the mid 90s when we want to find out about how and why this music was made. We want the recording sessions book in the late 80s because we want to know the specifics. So he was a fantastic guest and shed some real light, because I'm not a publisher. I just buy the books that I like to buy. But he had a real insight about how the Craig Brown book 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sure you know that book. Yeah. So that was a big hit. That comes out at the start of lockdown because people, certainly in the UK, I'm sure elsewhere, it's a crazy, weird time. I want something familiar. What's familiar? The Beatles. So that's when they buy that book. So he was a fantastic guest. I really enjoyed speaking to him. I think, yeah, they're the kind of I mean, I genuinely enjoy every conversation I've ever had. There was one interview with someone that never made it out because after about 10 minutes, they obviously weren't keen to talk. And I was like, okay, fine, we'll leave this one. But I'm on 87 episodes now, and I've genuinely loved all of them. Yes. It's so great to hear how I'm almost as interested in how the books arrive as being books. As you know, one of my first questions, which is a bit of an obvious question, is what was the inspiration for the book? Again, it's a good place to start because it sets the scene for the conversation. But it's so interesting to me, especially when it's someone that isn't a Beatle book writer. It's someone that has maybe written a book before, maybe hasn't written a book before, and they've decided to pour all this energy and love and time into the Beatles or a facet of the Beatles. So every conversation is special because I'm thinking, well, this person's, they've given up. I mean, it must take some of those books, the level of research, like the David Rees book about 1963, that was a great conversation. I mean, the level of detail in that, the time that he's taken, the research, the emails, the Zoom conversations, the people that he's spoken to. That's a journey. That's a story almost in itself.
Yes, it is.
That's why, yeah, I love all the conversations.
Yeah, fabulous. Is there a Beatles book, do you think, on a theme that is yet to be touched? Is that at all possible?
That's another fine question. I think there's definitely a book to be written about anthology.
Yes.
About how that came together. There's a story about in fact, I had Bob Smeaton, who worked on the anthology films and produced that and was involved in that whole project. That was about 2021. He was a great kind of bubbly guy from Newcastle over here in England. And I asked him, he was at some of those Three Tools recording sessions. And he was also on the special features on the anthology. There's a scene where the three of them are going through some recordings in Abbey Road with George Martin. And he's at that. And I said to him, tell me about that. What was that like? And he said, well, I still do some work for Apple, so I can't tell you everything about that day. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely something to be written about the dynamics of the three of them, how that project came together and the impact they had. I mean, anthology was, so as I'm 41, and I think for a load of people of my age and a bit older, a bit younger, anthology is the gateway. That's what got us in, because it was like, wow, this is incredible. There's all this new stuff as well. So I think there's a story to be written about that. I think there could be a really good book. Now, you've got Christine Feldman Barrett's book about Beatles and women, but I think you could find a really good book about the kind of female influence on all four of them, but maybe in particular John and Paul, not just Linda, Yoko, Jane, and Cynthia, but about other female figures in their lives, how that impacted their songwriting, impacted their kind of life choices. You know, the whole story of, you know, Alma Cogan, the singer that John, the UK singer that died really young, that John had a relationship with. She was apparently really influential on him. I think there's definitely some space for that. And you've got a book which is forthcoming by Ian Leslie about John and Paul, which is out in March of this year. We're recording 2025. And what that does is that looks a bit at the psychology of the two of them and about their relationship. I think psychology, believe it or not, could be another area that could be looked at. How these four guys related to each other, how their backgrounds impacted the way they were with the fans, the way they were with each other. Yeah, psychology. I think there's some legs there. But
Yeah.
who knows? Who knows?
I think you're onto something. I remember too, I was born in 69, and
Okay.
when John passed away, I was just getting into my Beatle fandom, and as much as that was obviously an incredible tragedy, there was this torrent of books and magazines, and suddenly you went from being a fan, having a hard time finding anything beyond the albums, to suddenly there was all this content, and sort of rediscovering now more of the story you described earlier, you know, seeing photographs of them through all these different periods. And I was, oh, wow, have a look at this. All these riches were coming forward. And then it wasn't until anthology came along that suddenly I started to really notice magazines out of the UK like Q and Mojo. And I remember Mojo was doing the anthology. I think they did a 3 cover series.
They did. Yes.
And some of the Mojo covers were works of art that you could frame.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, anthology was. I remember. So what was I, 11 or 12, and I went into like just a newsagent, a paper shop in the UK, the Saturday of when the first TV program was shown, and I think like 4 or 5 magazines had the Beatles on the front. Some of the supplements in the newspapers had the Beatles on the front. I mean, it was incredible. This is a band that by that point even had been gone for 20 plus years, and they were just everywhere still. I think it's hard to explain to those that weren't there, making me sound really old.
Yes.
But the impact of that, and of course in the UK, I don't know how much this was felt in other countries, but we had this big kind of Britpop moment where we had all these kind of Oasis and Blurs and Pulp and all these groups, some of which borrowed more from the Beatles than the others, but the Beatles kind of look like, especially that Revolver, Rubber Soul period, which a lot of those magazines went with, they look like these bands that were on Top of the Pops or were on the front cover of the NME, a Melody Maker. So it was like, well, yeah, you know, this band. It's funny actually. In the UK, they show, you know, the Top of the Pops series. They've been re-showing those for the last 10 or 12 years on BBC 4, and we're up to now on a Friday night. We're up to 1997. Great. So yeah, it's fantastic. And some of these Britpop bands that have just got no real lasting impact, but were great for that time and had great fun songs. And when you look at how they appear, the way that they're dressed like the Beatles recording Revolver. The hair, the tops, the shoes, the attitude, so the instruments, even the instruments that they're playing on Top of the Pops and other shows are really Beatles influence. So they just seemed to, they were kind of like a current band almost at that point. They didn't seem like an old band that your dad liked. Yeah. They fitted into that moment. I don't know about now. I don't know whether or not someone that's 18 now looks at a picture of them in 1965 and says, "Oh, they look really cool." I don't know. Who knows?
The way you've just described that culturally at the time with Britpop, I think you're absolutely right. There's a book to be made about the cultural impact and reinvigoration of the Beatles around anthology. There's no doubt about it. I remember driving through Brisbane City, and I couldn't believe it. There was a banner in the city heart that stretched across this main road that led in, and it was promoting anthology, and it just said with the classic logo, "The Beatles are back," with an exclamation mark. And I remember just thinking, I'm alive to see that. What does that even mean? The Beatles are back.
What What was the impact of the new songs out there? Were you gathered on the radio? Did they do like a TV premiere of the video? Do you remember what that was like? What Free as a Bird and Real Love were like?
Yeah, there was obviously a lot of buzz around that. I can remember getting up and getting in my car where I had a radio because we all knew that at this time on this morning they're going to play Free as a Bird.
Yeah.
And I remember the only way I could hear that was to get in the car, start the car and listen on the radio. And I remember sitting in the driveway just waiting. And I remember the DJ saying, I can't believe I'm sitting here in a studio and I'm about to say, here's the new single from the Beatles. But that's what I'm going to say. Here's Free as a Bird. I was already aware of the demo, which I loved when I just unearthed that on a boot. So I was aware of John's original demo. But I remember when those harmonies hit and I teared up. I can still remember sitting in the car. It was just hearing that blend of the harmonies.
Yeah.
First came. That was the moment, even now when I describe it, I get tingles because I remember the moment going, that's the Beatles.
Yeah.
Right there. The blend of those voices is eternal. And that was what hit me.
Yeah, I mean, I remember listening to Radio 1 played it at like, I think it might have been 4 a.m. I might have, I can't remember. I was 11, so I might have woken up. But I remember they had Annie Nightingale was the DJ that had known the Beatles and interviewed the Beatles. So they kind of had her on as like an expert. And she spoke about it, and she spoke in really, warm, positive terms about it. But it's and that video. Do you remember seeing that video for the first time?
Incredible.
I mean, what a piece of art that video is. That stands up now, doesn't it?
It's completely magnificent, and you're absolutely right. It's ageless, and it's easy to underappreciate just how much work. It is a work of art. How much work went into that piece?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Real Love video is fine and is good and fits the song, and the Now and Then video has, provoked some quite extreme reactions. I think it's okay. I don't think it's a disaster. I don't think it's great. But yeah, the Free as a Bird video, it's just, again, going back to Top of the Pops, I remember they played it on Top of the Pops because I didn't have satellite. Because we just had the normal TV in the UK. So whereas that like MTV would I imagine have been playing it a lot more, I didn't have access to that, and I couldn't go on YouTube and watch it because there was no YouTube. So I remember seeing it on Top of the Pops after the premiere, and I was like, they actually one last thing on Anthology. It is on YouTube. There was a program that ITV because ITV showed the Anthology in the UK. They had the premiere of Free as a Bird, and before Free as a Bird was shown, they showed a half-hour documentary, which was just lots of people being interviewed about the Beatles. So it went from people. It's quite an interesting collection of people. You've got people like Noel Gallagher, Jarvis Cocker, pop stars of the day. You've got Lulu and Sandy Shaw and other Scylla and other 60s pop stars. Then you've got people that have seemingly no connection to the Beatles, like a guy called Jimmy Knapp, who was the union leader of the RMT, the train in the UK.
Wow.
Completely random selection of people. It is on YouTube. But I remember watching that, and that I was like, all these cool people like the Beatles as well. I felt kind of an early sense of community there, which you get now from online. But it was like, well, look, Noel Gallagher likes the Beatles. He's really cool. I'm okay. I'm fine.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's a single book you'd recommend to someone as a gateway, let's say it's a new fan, is there a particular book that you think you would introduce and say, hey, this is a great place to start to open up that world?
I think there's the book by Jonathan Gould called Can't Buy Me Love,
right?
Which is probably written about 06, 07, that tells the story, but there's a bit more kind of cultural stuff around it, what was happening around the Beatles at the time. That's really good. The Rob Sheffield book, I mean, Rob was another great guest. I was privileged to have Rob on. That was terrific. He's a blast. His book, Dreaming the Beatles, is great because it talks about the Beatles kind of, again, how that book actually sort of tells their story through the 80s and 90s. So that could be good for someone that's a bit younger and is looking to relate it to, their cultural experience. I think they're the two that I would probably go for. I think the problem with the biographies, there's not that many biographies. if you take out Hunter Davies, you've got the Philip Norman shout, which is, heavily biased, as we all know, against Paul. And then you've got the Bob Spitz book, but that's a big, chunky book. Not necessarily a good place to start. Yeah, I would probably go with Doing the Beatles and Can't Buy Me Love by Jonathan Gould would be a good kind of bookends to start someone off.
It's wonderful. You've done Lewis and you've had so many great authors on the podcast. Is there a white whale? Is there still someone who you think, I don't know who you could possibly get beyond who you've had, but is there someone somewhere where you think, that would be a great story to unpack?
That's a good question. I think, funny enough, Jonathan Gould, actually, I would love to have on. I did message him at the time. Not at the time. I messaged him when I started. When I started, I just fired out loads of emails and Facebook messages to people because I wasn't in the groove yet, and I used to do two. I did two a month when I first started. But I don't know. I honestly can't think. Pete Doggett, maybe. I would like to have Pete Doggett on. He's one of those authors that's kind of been with the Beatles. He's written a couple of Beatles books, as we know. You've got the whole thing with him of the John in 1980 book, Prisoner of Love, that was spiked. Probably wouldn't be able to talk about that on the pod. But or things like with Pete Doggett, I know he met Magic Alex when he was writing You Never Give Me Your Money. That's probably a story. Yeah. So, someone like him that's had written several Beatles books and has been around the Beatle world, I'd like to find out about that. Because that's a good thing about, one of the good things about Mark Lewison when I was speaking to him was to get a sense of, because Mark was kind of in there for a bit. He's not now, but he was in that kind of Beatle family, wasn't he, in the 80s and 90s?
Yes.
And he was observing Neil Aspinall picking up the phone to Ringo in an office, or Derek and George having a coffee somewhere. Those little stories, and I think Pete Doggett might have seen some of that. Yeah, I would, I love that, how the machine works. Apple, the Beatles, there's loads of stories to tell there.
Absolutely. High hopes on Lewison's next Tune In volume, the next book in the series. How far do you think that might be?
I think that, so I'm blessed to say that Mark has become a friend after doing the podcast and a bit before, but it's not a question that I obviously pester him with much.
No.
But I know, what I can tell you is that I know that he's working almost as much on volume 3 as he is on volume 2. Yeah. I think he's taken the decision, age gets to us all, so he's got that kind of hanging over him. So I think we probably would have seen volume 2 by now if he hadn't devoted so much time to volume 3. But what he couldn't do when he realised the size of this task was do loads of work on 2, and then start at 3 with nothing, because then suddenly that finish line's much further into the future. I think that's what's taking his time now. But as he always says, it's got to be right. It's got to be full. It's got to be comprehensive, and it will be. I've no doubt that we will see it. Yeah. I don't think it's going to be a great loss to the mist of time, but I think he's focusing as much on 3, because at one point he was going to do a 4. He was thinking about doing a book about 1970, 1971, and how they dealt with the breakup. How did they relate to each other? How did they feel when they weren't Beatles anymore? But I know now, I'm pretty sure now he's junked that idea. Yeah. He's just going to focus 110% getting volume 2, volume 3 out there, and then he can, relax on the ranch.
Yeah, he's doing the Lord's work.
Absolutely.
What a legacy to leave behind when those volumes are in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think he's the right man to do it. I think he's the right man to tell this story. And of course, he gets criticism. All authors get criticism. All podcasters get criticism. That's part of putting stuff out in the world, as some people won't like it, or they'll say there's this angle and that angle. But I think in the main, I think his intentions are absolutely spot on. He just wants to get the story as full and as comprehensive as is possible, because it's sort of a disappearing history in some ways. He's got to get to these people, get those conversations down, get them into the book, because no one's here forever. And then in another 50, 100 years' time, that story will be there on a shelf for someone to pull down and look at, because it's important stuff. As all people listening to this will know, it's the best story and it's an important story. And if he can get it right, which I think he will do, I think we should allow him a little bit of slack. Hopefully, it'll be out soon.
I appreciate all the time you've given me, Joe. I want to end with a final question. We've talked books. Can we talk music? Is there an album you just go back to? I like to ask when we sit with people. Is there an album, may not be the greatest album in your mind that the Beatles delivered, but it was an album that you just find yourself, I'll go back to that one again and again. What sticks out?
I go back to Hard Day's Night. I go back to Hard Day's Night because, and nothing against George. I know George doesn't contribute much to Hard Day's Night, but and I love George, obviously. When I start the album to when I finish it, I'm a happier human being than from when I started. Whatever my mood is, if I'm in a good mood, I'm in a great mood by the end of it. And if I'm in not as good a mood or something bad's happened with the family or the work or whatever it is, I know that when I hear that first chord, I'm going to a good place. And it's partly because of the film. I love the film. When I was a kid, well, when I was in my teens, I used to go to London because I live still quite near London. So thanks to Mark Lewison and others, amazing Beatles London book, I could go to the Beatles sites. I could go to the places where a lot of those around Twickenham, where a lot of the scenes were shot. And so hearing the album takes me back as much to that time as anything else. But yeah, there's so much just hope and joy and excitement. They can't believe it's happening to them when you hear that album. And when you watch the film, they're like, this is happening to us. This is amazing. I can't believe this. And yeah, it does my heart good. Listen to Hard Day's Night.
That's beautiful. I think, and I'm not alone, obviously, it's their first masterpiece. It's a beautiful pop album. I find it flawless too. I remember my dad was a musician for a number of years, and one of my favorite little micro memories of him, I'd be playing the Beatles in the car and we're driving along away from a family event. I was playing A Hard Day's Night. And he's sort of sitting there nodding his head, looking out a window. And we were very good friends. And I Should Have Known Better was on. And when it finished, he just looked over at me. He said, God, that's a good song. And it was just this real genuine, hearing it again and just realizing when it's all said and done, they're just good songs.
Yeah. And you can sometimes forget that when you dive into the weeds of all this stuff, which we all do. And that's one of the magic of it, is those weeds are good weeds. We need to be in those weeds. But at the same time, when you take it back, when you hear those moments, when you hear John's, it's not on Hard Day's Night, but when you hear John's solo vocal line on This Boy, you just think this is perfection. There isn't anything better than that this is amazing. So I'm going to keep listening to that, please, because it makes me feel good. So yeah, thank goodness we had them, eh? Thank goodness we had them.
We hope you enjoyed the show. You know the name, look up the socials. You'll find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we can all come together. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe and spread the word. It all helps raise the profile of the You Can Talk to Me podcast. Thanks for listening.